In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, death strikes with poison. First the cheerful chemist, then a wealthy widow, and finally a young boy who saw too much. As fear grips the cobblestone streets, only Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed old lady with a knack for secrets, can unravel the clues. A scratched door, a hidden bottle, a nervous suspect. With cyanide lurking in brandy and lemonade, can she outsmart a cunning killer before they strike again? Dive into this chilling tale of murder and mystery. Chapter 1. The First Death. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet under a grey autumn sky, its cobblestone paths covered with fallen leaves in shades of red and gold. Small cottages with neat gardens lined the streets, their chimneys puffing soft smoke into the chilly air. The church steeple stood tall, watching over the village like a silent guard. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where secrets seemed impossible to keep. But secrets, as Miss Jane Marple knew, had a way of hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple sat by her window in her cosy sitting room, her knitting needles clicking softly. She worked on a pale blue shawl, the wool soft under her fingers. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her age, flicked up often to watch the world outside. She noticed everything: the postman's hurried steps, the grocer's boy whistling as he carried crates, the way Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, paused to whisper to a neighbour. To most, these were just daily sights. To Miss Marple, they were pieces of a puzzle, each one telling a story. It was a Tuesday morning, and the village felt oddly still. The usual chatter of St. Mary Mead seemed hushed, as if the air itself held its breath. Miss Marple's needles paused when she saw Constable Reed hurry past, his face tight with worry. She leaned closer to the window, her grey curls brushing the glass. Something was wrong. She could feel it, like a thread pulled too tight in her knitting. By noon, the news spread like wildfire. Mr. Clement, the village chemist, was dead. They found him in his shop, slumped over the counter, a glass of brandy beside him. The police said it was suicide. Poison, they whispered, mixed into the drink. The village buzzed with shock. Mr. Clement? Dead? The man who smiled at every customer, who always had a kind word. It didn't seem right. Miss Marple set her knitting down, her mind racing. She knew Mr. Clement well. He was a cheerful man, always busy in his little shop with its rows of bottles and jars. Just last week, at the church bazaar, he'd bought one of her knitted scarves, laughing as he said it would keep him warm on winter nights. He'd seemed happy, full of life. Suicide? No, that didn't fit. Poison was a bitter, painful way to die. If Mr. Clement had wanted to end his life, he'd have chosen something gentler. He knew chemicals better than anyone. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and walked to her small kitchen. As she boiled water for tea, she thought hard. Poison meant planning. It meant someone had a reason. And reasons, Miss Marple knew, were often buried deep, like roots under a garden. She poured her tea and sat again, sipping slowly. Her eyes drifted to the street, where villagers gathered in small groups, their voices low. She couldn't hear them, but she didn't need to. Their faces told her enough. Shock, fear, and something else. Suspicion. The chemist's shop sat at the corner of High Street, a small building with a green door and a sign that read Clement's Pharmacy. Miss Marple decided to take a walk. She put on her coat, a warm wool one, and her sturdy shoes. Her straw hat, pinned neatly to her curls, bobbed as she stepped outside. The air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke. She walked slowly, her cane tapping the stones, but her pace was deliberate. She wanted to see the shop, to feel the place where death had struck. As she neared High Street, she saw a small crowd outside the shop. The green door was shut, a policeman standing guard. Constable Reed, a young man with a serious face, nodded to her. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. "Sad business, this." "Very sad," she agreed, her voice soft but steady. "Poor Mr. Clement, such a kind man. Do they know what happened?" Reed shifted his weight. "They're saying he took his own life. Poison in his brandy. Doctor says it was quick." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes gentle but piercing. "Poison? That's a strange choice, isn't it? For a chemist, I mean. He knew so many ways to do such a thing." Reed frowned, as if the thought hadn't crossed his mind. "Suppose so," he said. "But that's what the inspector thinks. Suicide." She nodded, her face calm, but her mind was anything but. She glanced at the shop's window, its curtains drawn tight. A faint scratch mark on the doorframe caught her eye, barely visible unless you were looking. She filed it away, like a note tucked into a pocket. "Thank you, Constable," she said, and turned to walk on. The Blue Boar Inn was her next stop. It was the heart of village gossip, a place where tongues wagged over pints of ale and cups of tea. Miss Marple stepped inside, the warmth of the Ada fire greeting her. The inn was half full, villagers huddled at tables, their voices a low hum. She chose a small table by the window, ordered a pot of tea, and settled in to listen. Mrs. Price was there, her round face flushed as she spoke to the innkeeper. "I don't believe it for a minute," she said, her voice carrying. "Mr. Clement killing himself. He was happy as could be, and that shop of his was doing well. Why would he do it?" The innkeeper, a stout man named Mr. Higgs, shrugged. "People hide things, Mrs. Price. Maybe he had troubles we didn't know about." "Troubles?" Mrs. Price scoffed. "If he had troubles, it was that assistant of his, Mr. Barnes. Always skulking about, that one. I saw him arguing with Mr. Clement last month. Something about money." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her ears sharp. Mr. Barnes, the assistant. She knew him, a thin, nervous man with darting eyes. He'd worked for Mr. Clement for years, always in the background, mixing powders and counting pills. An argument? That was interesting. At another table, young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's apprentice, was talking to a friend. "I saw something. Odd," he said, his voice low but clear. "Night before last, there was a man near the shop. Not from the village. He had a limp, and he was looking at the shop real close, like he was planning something." Miss Marple's cup paused halfway to her lips. A stranger with a limp? That was a detail worth keeping. She made a mental note to talk to Tommy later. Boys like him noticed things others missed, especially when they were out late delivering meat. The inn grew louder as more villagers arrived, each with a theory. Some said Mr. Clement had debts. Others thought he'd been ill. Miss Clara, a spinster, who lived near the church, said she'd heard Mr. Clement arguing with someone days before. "A woman's voice," she said, her eyes wide. "I couldn't hear the words, but it sounded angry." Miss Marple listened to it all, her face calm, her mind sorting. She didn't believe in suicide, not for Mr. Clement. The poison, the locked shop, the scratch on the door. It all pointed to something darker. Murder, perhaps. But who? And why? She finished her tea and left the inn, the cold air sharp against her cheeks. The village was settling into dusk, the sky a deep purple. She walked past the chemist's shop again, slowing her steps. The policeman was gone now. The street quiet. She stood for a moment, her eyes tracing the building's edges. The scratch mark was still there, faint but real. It wasn't the kind of mark a key or a careless bump would make. It looked deliberate, like someone had forced the lock. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and sat with her knitting. The flames crackled, casting shadows on the walls. She thought about Mr. Clement, his shop, his life. He'd been a careful man, precise in his work. If someone poisoned him, they'd have needed access to his shop, his brandy, his trust, or they'd have needed to break in. She thought about the suspects. Mr. Barnes, the assistant, with his nervous ways and possible argument. The stranger with the limp, seen lurking near the shop. The woman Miss Clara heard, her voice angry. And then there was the village itself, full of small grudges and hidden motives. St. Mary Mead looked peaceful, but Miss Marple knew better. Every village had its shadows. As she knitted, her mind worked like a loom, weaving facts and guesses into patterns. Poison wasn't easy to get. It took knowledge or access to a place like the chemist's shop. Mr. Clement had kept dangerous things, cyanide, arsenic, strychnine, locked away. But locks could be broken, or keys could be stolen. She thought about the brandy. Mr. Clement liked a glass in the evening, a habit everyone knew. Someone could have slipped poison into the bottle, knowing he'd drink it. But that meant planning, watching, waiting. It meant hate or fear or greed. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. She remembered a story from years ago in another village. A man had died, poisoned, and everyone thought it was an accident. But she'd noticed a tiny detail. A bottle moved from its usual place, and it had led to the truth. A jealous wife, a hidden affair. Could this be like that? Or was it something else entirely? She set her knitting down and stood, her joints creaking. She walked to her desk and took out a small notebook. In neat handwriting she wrote, "Mr. Clement, poison, brandy, scratch on door. Mr. Barnes, argument, stranger with limp. Angry woman's voice." She stared at the list, her eyes narrowing. It was a start, but only a start. The village clock struck 8, its chime echoing through the quiet. Miss Marple closed her notebook and returned to her chair. She wouldn't rush. Truth, good knitting, took time. She'd watch, listen, and wait. Someone in St. Mary Mead had a secret, and she meant to find it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The village slept, unaware of the darkness that had crept into its heart. But Miss Marple was awake, her mind sharp, her heart steady. Death had come to St. Mary Mead, and she would not rest until she knew why. Chapter 2. Whispers in the village. The morning after Mr. Clement's death, St. Mary Mead woke to a heavy mist that clung to the cobblestone streets like a shroud. The village felt different now, as if the news of the chemist's passing had cast a shadow over its tidy cottages and blooming gardens. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a cup of tea steaming beside her toast. Her knitting lay folded on a chair, but her hands were still, her sharp eyes gazing out the window. She was thinking, piecing together the bits of yesterday's puzzle. The poison, the brandy, the scratch mark on the shop's door. Something wasn't right, and she meant to find out what. By 9 o'clock, the village was alive with chatter. People gathered in small knots outside the post office, the Yaoxiu bakery, and the churchyard, their voices low but urgent. Miss Marple put on her coat and hat, her cane tapping softly as she stepped outside. The air was damp, smelling of wet leaves and earth. She walked toward the Blue Boar Inn, knowing it was the best place to hear what the village was saying. Gossip, she knew, was like a river. It carried truth and lies together, and a careful listener could sift one from the other. The inn was busy, its windows glowing with warm light against the grey morning. Miss Marple pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, the smell of fresh bread and ale greeting her. Villagers filled the tables, their faces a mix of worry and excitement. Death was rare in St. Mary Mead, and murder, or the whisper of it, was rarer still. She chose a corner table, ordered a pot of tea, and settled in, her ears open like a net cast wide. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, was at the centre of a group near the bar. Her voice was loud, her cheeks red. "I'm telling you, it wasn't suicide," she said, banging her mug on the table. "Mr. Clement was happy. I saw him at the bazaar, buying that scarf from Miss Marple. He was joking, laughing. Why would a man like that kill himself?" Mr. Higgs, the innkeeper, leaned over the counter wiping a glass. "Maybe he had secrets," he said. "People do, you know. Debts, maybe, or trouble at home." "Debts?" Mrs. Price snorted. "His shop was always busy, and he lived alone. No family to trouble him. If you ask me, someone did him in. Poison's not something you just swallow by mistake." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her face calm, but her mind racing. Mrs. Price's words echoed her own thoughts. Poison was deliberate, a choice made by someone with a plan. She listened as others joined in. Old Mr. Turner, who ran the hardware store, said he'd heard Mr. Clement owed money to someone in the next town. "Loan gone bad," he muttered. "That's what I heard." Miss Marple made a mental note. Debts were a motive, but rumours weren't proof. She needed facts, solid as the stones under her feet. Her eyes drifted to another table, where young Tommy Pierce sat with his friend Jimmy, the grocer's boy. Tommy's voice was low, but Miss Marple's sharp ears caught every word. "I'm telling you, I saw that man again," Tommy said, his eyes wide. "The one with the limp. Last night, near the shop. He was standing in the alley just watching. Gave me the creeps." Jimmy leaned closer. "You sure it was the same man? The one from before Mr. Clement died?" Tommy nodded. "Swear it, he had that same coat, dark and long, and the limp, couldn't miss it. I didn't stick around to see what he was doing." Miss Marple's cup paused at her lips. The stranger with the limp again. Tommy had mentioned him yesterday, seen near the chemist's shop the night before the death. Now he'd been spotted again, after the shop was locked and guarded. That was no coincidence. She decided to talk to Tommy later, when the inn was quieter. Boys like him could be shy with adults, but she knew how to put them at ease. The door swung open, and Miss Clara stepped in, her thin frame wrapped in a grey shawl. She was a spinster, sharp-tongued and nosy, but Miss Marple liked her for her honesty. Clara sat at a table nearby, her eyes darting around the room. Mrs. Price called out to her. "Clara, you live near the shop. Did you see anything odd before Mr. Clement died?" Clara's lips tightened. "I heard something," she said, her voice low. "2 nights ago, I was closing my curtains, and I heard voices from the shop. Mr. Clement's and someone else. A woman, I think. They were arguing, sharp and angry. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't friendly." The inn went quiet for a moment, everyone leaning in. Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "A woman? Who could it be? Mr. Clement wasn't married, and he didn't have a sweetheart, far as I know." Clara shrugged. "I didn't see her, just heard the voices. Next day, He was dead. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her face still, like a pond with no ripples. An angry woman, a stranger with a limp, a possible debt. The pieces were piling up, but they didn't fit yet. She thought about Mr. Barnes, the chemist's assistant, mentioned yesterday for arguing with Mr. Clement. Could he be tied to this woman, or the stranger? She needed to see the shop again, to look at that scratch mark in daylight. She finished her tea and stood, nodding politely to Mrs. Price and Clara. Outside, the mist had lifted, but the air was still cold, biting at her cheeks. She walked toward High Street, her cane steady on the uneven stones. The chemist's shop came into view, its green door shut tight, a policeman still standing guard. Constable Reed was gone, replaced by a younger man, Constable Harris, who looked bored and cold. "Good morning, Constable," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "Such a sad thing, isn't it? Poor Mr. Clement." Harris nodded, rubbing his hands together. "Sad, yes. Strange business, too. They're still saying it's suicide, but folks around here don't seem to believe it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but searching. "The village does love to talk," she said. "I suppose you've seen nothing odd around the shop?" Harris hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing much. Just folks coming by to gawk. The inspector's been inside, looking at things. Says it's all straightforward." She smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. Straightforward. Not with that scratch mark. She stepped closer to the door, pretending to adjust her shawl. Her eyes found the mark again, faint but clear in the daylight. It was deep, like a tool had scraped the wood. A knife, maybe, or a screwdriver used to force the lock. She looked at the lock itself, a heavy brass one. It didn't seem damaged, but that didn't mean much. A skilled hand could pick a lock or force it without leaving obvious signs. "Thank you, Constable," she said, and turned to walk away. Her heart was beating faster now. The scratch mark was no accident. Someone had been in the shop. Someone who didn't belong. She thought about the brandy, the poison, the locked door. If the killer had broken in, they'd have needed to know Mr. Clement's habits, when he drank, where he kept his bottles. That pointed to someone close, someone who knew him well. Her next stop was the church. A short walk down a lane lined with yew trees. The churchyard was quiet. The gravestones, mossy and tilted. She found Mrs. Gray, the wealthy widow, tending the flowers near the gate. Mrs. Gray was a tall woman, her hair still dark despite her age. She was known for her sharp mind and sharper tongue, but she liked Miss Marple, who always listened without judging. "Good morning, Lavinia," Miss Marple said, pausing by the gate. "Such a sad time for the village." Mrs. Gray straightened, brushing dirt from her gloves. "Sad and strange," she said. "I can't believe Mr. Clement took his own life. He was in my shop just last week, buying headache powders. Seemed fine to me." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle. "People are saying all sorts of things. Debts, arguments, even a stranger in the village. Have you heard anything?" Mrs. Gray's lips pursed. "I heard about that stranger. Tommy Pierce was talking about him at the grocer's. A man with a limp, lurking about. And I know Mr. Clement had words with his assistant, Mr. Barnes. My maid, Elsie, saw them shouting outside the shop a few weeks ago. Something about missing stock." Miss Marple's heart skipped. Missing stock? That was new. "Missing stock?" she asked, keeping her voice light. "What kind?" Mrs. Gray shrugged. Elsie didn't hear details, but Mr. Clement was angry, waving his arms. "Mr. Barnes looked scared," she said. Miss Marple filed it away. Missing stock could mean anything. Medicine, money, or something dangerous like poison. She thanked Mrs. Gray and walked on, her mind buzzing. Mr. Barnes was climbing higher on her list of suspects. An argument, missing stock, and his nervous ways. It all painted a picture, but not a clear one yet. She circled back to High Street, passing the shop again. The constable was still there, but he was talking to a delivery boy now, his back turned. Miss Marple moved quickly, her cane silent on the stones. She crouched by the door, her joints protesting, and looked closer at the scratch mark. It was deeper than she'd thought, and there was a tiny splinter of metal caught in the wood. She plucked it out with her fingers, careful not to be seen, and slipped it into her pocket. It was small, barely a sliver, but it could be a clue, a piece of a tool, maybe. She stood, her heart pounding. The metal was hard evidence, something the police had missed. She'd show it to Constable Reed later, but for now she'd keep it safe. She walked home, her steps slow but steady. The village was settling into noon, the streets quieter as people went indoors for lunch. Miss Marple's cottage welcomed her with its familiar warmth, the smell of wax polish and dried lavender. She sat by the fire, taking the metal sliver from her pocket. It was thin, slightly, curved like a piece of a blade or a lockpick. She wrapped it in a handkerchief and tucked it into her desk drawer. Then she took out her notebook and added to her list, scratch mark, forced entry, metal sliver. Mr. Barnes, missing stock, woman's voice, argument, stranger with limp, seen again. The village clock struck 1, its chime soft through the walls. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes half closed. The puzzle was growing, but so was her certainty. Mr. Clement's death was no suicide. Someone had planned it, someone clever and careful. But careful people made mistakes, and she would find theirs. Outside, the mist was gone, but the sky stayed grey, heavy with the promise of rain. St. Mary Mead looked peaceful, its secrets buried deep. But Miss Marple was watching, her mind sharp as a needle, ready to stitch the truth together, one clue at a time. Chapter 3. A second tragedy. The mist had cleared in St. Mary Mead by Friday morning, but a heavy feeling hung over the village, like a storm waiting to break. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a shawl around her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking softly. The pale blue shawl was growing, but her mind wasn't on the wool. She was thinking about Mr. Clement's death, the scratch mark on his shop's door, the metal sliver in her drawer, and the whispers she'd heard at the Blue Boar Inn. A stranger with a limp, an angry woman's voice. Mr. Barnes and missing stock. Each was a thread in a tangled web, and she was determined to unravel it. The village was still buzzing about the chemist's death. Some clung to the idea of suicide, but others, like Mrs. Price, spoke of murder in hushed tones. Miss Marple knew the truth lay somewhere in the shadows, hidden behind locked doors and nervous glances. She sipped her tea, her sharp eyes scanning the street. A delivery boy pedalled by, and Mrs. Gray's maid, Elsie, hurried past with a basket of laundry. Everything seemed normal, but Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease, like a stitch dropped in her knitting. By noon, she decided to visit Mrs. Lavinia Gray, the wealthy widow she'd spoken to in the churchyard. Mrs. Gray was hosting a garden party. That afternoon, a small gathering of villagers to raise money for the church roof. Miss Marple thought it a good chance to watch and listen. People let their guards down at parties, and secrets slipped out like crumbs from a loaf. She put on her best dress, a soft grey one, and her straw hat, pinning it to her curls. Her cane tapped the cobblestones as she walked to Mrs. Gray's grand house at the edge of the village. The Gray estate was a sight, with its tall hedges and rose gardens, the lawn clipped neat as a postcard. Tables were set with white cloths, laden with sandwiches, cakes, and pitchers of lemonade. Villagers mingled, their voices bright but strained. Mr. Clement's death was on everyone's mind, and Miss Marple caught snatches of talk as she moved through the crowd. "Such a shock," said one woman. "I heard he owed money," muttered another. Miss Marple smiled politely, her ears sharp as she poured herself a glass of lemonade. Mrs. Gray stood near the rose arbour, greeting guests. She wore a dark green dress, her hair swept up, her smile warm but tight. Beside her was her nephew, Harold Gray, a tall man with slick hair and a restless look. Miss Marple knew Harold lived in the next town, but visited often, hoping to inherit his aunt's fortune. He was charming when he wanted to be, but Miss Marple had seen his kind before, men who smiled while calculating. She approached Mrs. Gray, her face kind. "Lavinia, what a lovely party," she said. "You've outdone yourself." Mrs. Gray's smile softened. "Thank you, Jane. It's good to have something cheerful after this week." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle. "Poor Mr. Clement. The village is still reeling. Have you heard any more about it?" Mrs. Gray's face tightened. "Only what everyone's saying. Debts, arguments, that sort of thing. I still can't believe it was suicide. He was in my shop last week, perfectly fine." Harold stepped closer, his voice smooth. "People hide their troubles, Aunt Lavinia. Maybe Clement had problems we didn't know about." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Harold, noting his quick words. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but poison is a strange choice. So deliberate." Harold's smile faltered, but he recovered fast. "Well, the police seem sure. Best to let them handle it." Mrs. Gray frowned, but before she could speak, a guest called her away. Miss Marple stayed near the arbour, sipping her lemonade, watching Harold. He moved through the crowd, laughing too loudly, his eyes darting. Nervous, she thought. But why? The party went on. The sun warmed despite the autumn chill. Miss Marple sat at a table with Miss Clara and Mrs. Price, listening to their chatter. Miss Clara repeated her story of the angry woman's voice outside the chemist's shop, adding that she'd seen Mr. Barnes looking shifty that same night. Mrs. Price nodded, her voice low. "I heard Mr. Clement was short on stock. Medicines missing, maybe even poisons. That Barnes knows more than he's saying." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her face calm. Missing poisons? That fit with Elsie's story about the argument. She made a mental note to talk to Elsie, who was serving tea nearby. Servants saw things others missed, and Elsie was young enough to speak freely if asked kindly. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd thinned. Miss Marple was about to leave when a scream cut through the air. It came from the rose arbour, where Mrs. Gray had been standing moments before. The villagers froze, then rushed toward the sound. Miss Marple followed, her cane steady, her heart pounding. Mrs. Gray lay on the grass, her face pale, her lips tinged blue. Her glass of lemonade lay spilled beside her, the liquid soaking into the earth. Her eyes were wide, unseeing, and her breath was gone. The crowd gasped, some crying out, others backing away. Harold knelt beside her, his face white. "Aunt Lavinia!" he shouted, shaking her shoulders. "Someone help!" Miss Marple pushed through, her small frame surprisingly strong. She knelt by Mrs. Gray, her fingers brushing the woman's wrist. No pulse, She leaned closer, her nose catching a faint, bitter smell from the spilled lemonade. Almonds, she thought, her stomach twisting. Cyanide. The same poison that killed Mr. Clement. Dr. Haydock, the village doctor, was at the party and hurried over. He checked Mrs. Gray, his face grim. "She's gone," he said. "Looks like a heart attack. Her heart wasn't strong, you know." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. A heart attack? With that smell? She didn't believe it. She stood, her knees creaking, and looked at the glass. It was empty now. The liquid gone into the grass, but the smell lingered. She glanced at Harold, who was pale and trembling, his hands clenched. Grief? Or something else? The crowd murmured. Shock turning to fear. 2 deaths in a week. First the chemist, now the widow. Miss Marple heard whispers of curse and bad luck. But she knew better. This was no accident. She stepped back, letting Dr. Haydock and the others take charge. Constable Reed arrived, his face serious as he cordoned off the area. Miss Marple watched, her mind racing. She found Elsie near the house, the maid's face streaked with tears. "Elsie," Miss Marple said gently, touching her arm. "This is awful, isn't it? Can you tell me anything about Mrs. Gray or the party?" Elsie sniffled, wiping her eyes. "She was fine earlier, miss, happy even, but I heard her arguing with Mr. Harold this morning in the study. Something about her will. She said she was changing it, and he got mad." Miss Marple's heart skipped. Changing her will? That was a motive, clear as day. "Thank you, Elsie," she said, patting the girl's hand. "You've been very helpful." As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the arbour. She noticed a small table where the lemonade pitcher sat, half empty. Other glasses were there, untouched, with no strange smell. Only Mrs. Gray's glass had been poisoned. She was sure. Someone had targeted her, just as they'd targeted Mr. Clement. She walked home slowly. The village quiet now. The party's cheer replaced by dread. Her cottage welcomed her with its warmth, the fire crackling softly. She sat at her desk, taking out her notebook. She wrote, "Mrs. Gray, cyanide, lemonade, heart attack. Harold will argument, same poison as Clement." She paused, then added, "targeted, planned." The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still blurry. 2 deaths, both by poison, both in public places. Mr. Clement in his shop, Mrs. Gray at her party. The killer was bold, striking, where people felt safe. But why these 2? What tied them together? Miss Marple thought about Mrs. Gray's life. She was wealthy, with a big house and investments. She'd mentioned Mr. Clement buying headache powders, and Elsie had said they'd argued about stock. Could Mrs. Gray have known something about the chemist's shop? Maybe she'd been a silent partner, or had noticed something odd. And Harold, his anger over the will suggested greed. But was he clever enough to use cyanide? She thought about Mr. Barnes, the nervous assistant. He had access to poisons, and the missing stock pointed to him. Then there was the stranger with the limp, seen near the shop. Was he the killer, or just a witness? And the woman's voice Miss Clara heard. Could it be Mrs. Gray herself, arguing with Mr. Clement before her death? Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched, her mind too busy. She stood and paced, her small frame moving with purpose. The metal sliver from the shop's door was still in her drawer, a reminder of forced entry. Had the killer broken in to get the poison, or to plant it? She needed to see the shop again, to look for more clues. The village clock struck 6, its chime echoing through the dusk. Miss Marple sat again, her eyes half closed. She pictured the party, the arbour, the glass of lemonade. Someone had slipped cyanide into it, knowing Mrs. Grey would drink. It was quick, clever and cruel. The killer was close, part of the village, hiding behind a familiar face. She thought about her old friend, Dolly Bantry, who'd once helped solve a mystery in St. Mary Mead. Dolly had said, "Evil doesn't always look evil, Jane. It wears a smile." Miss Marple nodded to herself. The killer was smiling, shaking, hands sipping tea. But they'd made mistakes. The scratch mark, the metal sliver, the smell of almonds, and she would find them. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. St. Mary Mead was no longer the safe haven it seemed. Death had struck twice, and Miss Marple feared it wasn't done. She picked up her knitting, her needles clicking once, more. The shawl grew, stitch by stitch, just as her plan did. She'd watch, listen, and wait. The truth was out there, and she would pull it into the light. Chapter 4. The suspects emerge. By Saturday morning. St. Mary Mead was a village on edge. The deaths of Mr. Clement and Mrs. Grey, just days apart, had shattered its quiet charm. The cobblestone streets, once cheerful with children's laughter, now carried whispers of fear. Miss Jane Marple sat by her fireplace, her knitting needles still, her pale blue shawl folded neatly beside her. Her mind was busy, sorting through clues like threads in a tangled skein. The scratch mark on the chemist's door, the metal sliver, the bitter almond smell of cyanide, and the whispers of arguments and strangers. 2 deaths, both by poison, were no coincidence. A killer walked among them, and she meant to find them. The village buzzed with theories. Some clung to the police's story. Suicide for Mr. Clement, a heart attack for Mrs. Grey. But others, like Miss Marple, saw darker truths. She sipped her tea, her sharp eyes flicking to the window. Outside the sky was grey, the air heavy with the threat of rain. She thought about the suspects taking shape in her mind. Harold Grey, greedy for his aunt's fortune. Mr. Barnes, the nervous chemist's assistant with access to poisons. And Miss Clara, who'd heard an angry woman's voice near the shop. Each held a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple was ready to fit them together. She decided to start with Miss Clara. The spinster was prickly but honest, and her story of the argument outside Mr. Clement's shop was a loose thread worth tugging. Miss Marple wrote a note, inviting Clara for tea that afternoon. She kept it friendly, mentioning a shared love of gardening to set Clara at ease. Then she dressed in her warm coat and straw hat, her cane tapping as she stepped outside. The village felt hushed, as if holding its breath. She walked to the post office to drop off the note, her eyes scanning the streets for anything odd. At the post office, Mrs. Price was behind the counter, sorting letters. Her round face was pale, her usual chatter subdued. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, managing a smile. "Awful times, aren't they? First Mr. Clement, now Mrs. Grey. People are scared to drink their tea." Miss Marple nodded, her face kind but her ears sharp. "It's dreadful," she said. "Have you heard anything new? About Mrs. Grey, perhaps?" Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice low. "They're saying it was her heart, but I don't believe it. She was healthy as a horse, and I heard from Elsie, her maid, that Harold was furious about the will. Wanted her money for some business deal, but she wouldn't give it." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression calm. "Harold does seem eager," she said. "Anything else?" Mrs. Price hesitated, then whispered, "Elsie said Mrs. Gray was asking questions about Mr. Clement's shop. Wanted to know about their stock. She suspected something. Maybe that's why she argued with Harold, Mr. Barnes, who'd been seen arguing with Mr. Clement about missing stock. Could Mrs. Gray have known something dangerous?" She thanked Mrs. Price and left, her mind buzzing. The connection between the deaths was growing clearer, but the motive was still foggy. Back home, Miss Marple prepared for Clara's visit. She set out her best china, a plate of scones and a pot of tea. The fire crackled, warming the small sitting room. At 3 o'clock, Clara arrived, her grey shawl tight around her thin shoulders. Her eyes were sharp, darting around the room, but she relaxed when Miss Marple offered a scone. "Thank you, Jane," Clara said, her voice crisp. "It's good to get out. The village is so gloomy now." Miss Marple poured tea, her movements slow and deliberate. "It's a sad time," she agreed. "Poor Mr. Clement, and now Mrs. Gray. You must hear a lot, living so close to the shop." Clara's cup rattled in its saucer, her fingers trembling. "Too much," she said. "All this talk of poison and murder. I can't sleep thinking about it." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes gentle but piercing. "You mentioned hearing voices that night, outside the shop. A woman, you said. Can you remember anything more?" Clara's lips tightened, as if weighing her words. "It was late," she said. "I was at my window, closing the curtains. I heard Mr. Clement, loud and angry. Then a woman's voice, sharp, like she was scolding him. I couldn't hear the words, but it went on for a bit. Then it stopped and I saw someone hurry away. A shadow, really. Couldn't tell who." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "Did you see Mr. Barnes that night, or anyone else?" Clara's eyes flickered, and she set her cup down. "I saw Mr. Barnes earlier, locking up. He looked nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, and, well, I didn't want to say, but I heard something else. A few days before Mr. Clement died, he was at my gate, talking to me about my sister." Miss Marple's heart skipped. Clara's sister, Emily, had died years ago, a tragedy the village still whispered about. "Your sister?" she asked softly. Clara's voice dropped, her hands twisting in her lap. "Emily died from a bad prescription, or so I always thought. Mr. Clement made it up years ago. I blamed him, you know. I was angry for a long time. A few days before he died, he came to me, saying he was sorry. Said he'd made a mistake back then, but it wasn't his fault. I didn't believe him. We argued right there by my gate." Miss Marple's breath caught, but she kept her face calm. "Clara, arguing with Mr. Clement. That was new, and it put her on the suspect list. Revenge was a powerful motive, even years later." "That must have been hard," she said. "Did you tell anyone?" Clara shook her head. "No, I was ashamed losing my temper like that. And then he died, and I didn't want people thinking I had anything to do with it." Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, her touch warm. "You've done right to tell me," she said. "It's important to know the truth." Clara left soon after, her steps quick, as she hurried home. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her mind sorting through what she'd learned. Clara's story was troubling. An old grudge, a fresh argument. Could she have poisoned Mr. Clement? And what about Mrs. Gray? Clara lived near the shop, but she'd been at the garden party. Could she have slipped cyanide into the lemonade? Mrs. Marple stood and paced, her small frame moving with purpose. She thought about Harold Gray, his anger over the will, his nervous demeanour at the party. He was a clear suspect. Greed could drive a man to murder, especially one like Harold, who lived beyond his means. And Mrs. Gray's questions about the chemist's shop suggested she'd stumbled onto something dangerous, maybe tied to the missing stock. Then there was Mr. Barnes, the assistant. He had access to the shop, to poisons, and he'd argued with Mr. Clement. The missing stock, possibly cyanide, pointed straight to him. His nervous ways and shifty glances didn't help. Miss Marple pictured him in the shop, mixing powders, counting pills. He knew chemicals as well as Mr. Clement did. Poison would be easy for him. She took out her notebook, her handwriting neat despite her racing thoughts. She wrote, Clara, argument with Clement, sister's death. Harold, Will, greedy. Barnes, missing stock, nervous. Mrs. Gray knew about shop. She paused, then added, cyanide. 2 deaths, same killer. The village clock struck 5. Its chimed soft through the walls. Miss Marple put the notebook away and walked to her window. The street was quiet, the cottages glowing with lamplight. She thought about the stranger with the limp, seen near the shop. Was he the killer, or just a red herring? And the woman's voice. Clara, Mrs. Gray, someone else. She decided to visit the chemist's shop again, to see if the police had missed anything else. She waited until dusk, when the streets were empty, and slipped out, her coat buttoned tight against the chill. The shop was dark, the green door locked, no policeman in sight. Miss Marple moved carefully, her cane silent on the stones. She checked the scratch mark again. Still there, still deep. The metal sliver she'd found was safe in her drawer, but she wanted more. She circled to the back, where a narrow alley ran behind the shop. The back door was plain, with a simple lock. She examined it, her eyes sharp in the fading light. Another scratch mark, fainter than the one on the front door, but there. Her heart raced. 2 forced entries, or 1 killer, coming and going. She heard a noise, a twig snapping, and froze. Her eyes scanned the alley, but no one was there. Just the wind, she told herself. But her pulse was quick. She hurried home, her steps faster now. The village felt different at night. Its shadows deeper, its secrets heavier. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and sat with her knitting. The needles clicked, but her mind was elsewhere. She pictured the shop, the brandy, the lemonade. Cyanide was quick, deadly, and hard to get. The killer had planned both deaths, choosing moments when no one would suspect. Mr. Clement alone in his shop, Mrs. Gray at her party. Bold, clever, and cruel. She thought about Clara's story. The pain in her voice, the anger over her sister's death. It was real. But was it enough to kill? And Harold, his slick charm hid something darker, she was sure. Mr. Barnes was the weakest link, his access to poisons too perfect to ignore. Miss Marple's needles paused. 3 suspects, 3 motives, but only 1 killer. She stood and took the metal sliver from her drawer, holding it to the firelight. It was small, but it told a story. Someone had broken into the shop. Maybe to steal cyanide, maybe to plant the poison. She wrapped it back in its handkerchief and locked the drawer. Tomorrow, she'd talk to Constable Reed, show him the sliver, ask about the shop's stock. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls. Miss Marple sat again, her eyes half closed. She remembered a case years ago, a poisoning in another village. The killer had been a quiet man, unnoticed until she'd spotted a lie in his story. This killer was like that, hiding in plain sight, blending into St. Mary Mead's daily life. Outside, the wind moaned, rattling the windows. The village slept, but Miss Marple was awake, her mind sharp as a blade. 2 deaths, 2 poisons, 1 truth. She would find it, stitch by stitch, until the killer's mask fell away. Chapter 5. A chilling discovery. Sunday morning dawned cold in St. Mary Mead, the sky a heavy grey that pressed down on the village like a lid. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of frost and damp earth. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming beside her, her knitting untouched. Her mind was busy, weaving together the clues from the past week. Mr. Clement's poisoned brandy, Mrs. Gray's deadly lemonade, the scratch marks on the chemist's shop, and the metal sliver in her drawer. 2 deaths, both by cyanide, pointed to a single killer, someone clever, bold, and hiding among the villagers. She was determined to unmask them. The village was restless, its usual calm shattered by fear. Whispers of murder had replaced talk of weather and crops. Miss Marple's notebook lay open, her neat handwriting listing suspects. Harold Gray, greedy for his aunt's fortune. Mr. Barnes, the nervous assistant with access to poisons. And Miss Clara, driven by an old grudge over her sister's death. Each had a motive, but the truth was still out of reach, like a stitch too tight to pull free. Today was Church Day, a time when St. Mary Mead gathered as one. Miss Marple knew it was a chance to watch her suspects, to catch a glance or a word that might betray them. She put on her warm coat, pinned her straw hat to her grey curls, and stepped outside, her cane tapping the cobblestones. The streets were quiet, villagers hurrying to the church, their faces tight with worry. 2 deaths in a week had left a mark, and Miss Marple felt the weight of their fear. The church stood at the village's heart, its steeple piercing the grey sky. Inside, the pews were full, the air thick with the smell of wax and old hymnals. Miss Marple took her usual seat near the back, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Harold Gray sat near the front, his slick hair gleaming, his hands restless in his lap. Mr. Barnes was a few rows back, his thin face pale, his eyes darting to the door. Miss Clara sat across the aisle, her shawl tight around her shoulders, her lips moving in silent prayer. Miss Marple noted their unease, filing it away like a note in her pocket. The vicar's sermon was about trust and truth, but Miss Marple barely listened. Her mind was on the killer. Cyanide was rare, needing skill to use without detection. The shop's missing stock, possibly poisons, pointed to Mr. Barnes, but Harold's greed and Clara's anger couldn't be ignored. And then there was the stranger with the limp, seen near the shop. Was he the key, or just a shadow? As the service ended, villagers lingered in the churchyard, their voices low. Miss Marple stayed seated, pretending to adjust her shawl, watching through the open door. Harold spoke to the vicar, his smile forced. Mr. Barnes slipped out quickly, his head down. Clara stood by a gravestone, her face hard. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. They were all nervous, but who was hiding the most? She rose and walked outside, the cold biting her cheeks. The churchyard was dotted with old stones, some tilted, some mossy. She saw young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's apprentice, sweeping leaves near the gate. Tommy had mentioned the stranger with the limp, a detail that stuck in her mind. She approached him, her smile warm. "Good morning, Tommy," she said. "Keeping the yard tidy, I see." Tommy grinned, leaning on his broom. "Morning, Miss Marple. Trying to, anyway. Leaves keep falling." She nodded, her eyes gentle. "You've got sharp eyes, Tommy. You told me about that stranger by the shop, the one with the limp. Have you seen him since?" Tommy's grin faded, his eyes flicking to the trees. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "Last night, near the river. He was standing by the bridge, holding something. Looked like a bottle, small, like the ones in Mr. Clement's shop. I didn't get close. He scares me." Miss Marple's heart raced, but she kept her face calm. "A bottle? Like the cyanide used in the murders?" "You did right to stay away," she said. "Did you see his face?" Tommy shook his head. "Too dark. Just the limp and that long coat. I told Constable Reed, but he said it's probably nothing." Miss Marple patted his arm. "You're a good boy, Tommy. Keep those eyes open." She walked away, her mind buzzing. The stranger was no ghost. He was real, and he was close. But was he the killer, or a witness who saw too much? She decided to visit the chemist's shop again to check the back door's scratch mark she'd found last night. The streets were emptying as villagers went home for Sunday lunch. She moved quickly, her cane silent, sticking to the quieter lanes. The shop loomed ahead, its green door locked, its windows dark. No policeman stood guard now. The investigation, slowed by the police's belief in suicide and heart attack. She slipped into the alley behind the shop, her heart pounding. The back door was plain, its lock simple. The scratch mark was still there, faint but deep, like the one out front. She knelt, her joints creaking, and ran her finger along it. No new marks, no signs of recent entry. But the mark told a story. Someone had forced their way in, maybe to steal the cyanide that killed Mr. Clement and Mrs. Gray. A noise made her freeze. A rustle in the bushes. She stood, her eyes scanning the alley. Nothing moved, but the air felt heavy, as if someone was watching. She hurried out, her steps quick, her cane tapping now. Back on High Street she breathed easier, but the feeling lingered. The killer was close, and they knew the village was asking questions. At home, Miss Marple lit the fire and sat with her notebook. She wrote, "Tommy, stranger with limp, bottle by river. Back door, scratch mark confirmed. Suspects nervous at church." She paused, then added, "Killer watching." The thought sent a chill through her, but she pushed it aside. Fear wouldn't help her now. She decided to talk to Constable Reed about the metal sliver and the scratch marks. She wrapped the sliver in its handkerchief and walked to the police station, a small building near the village square. Reed was there, his young face tired. "Miss Marple," he said, standing. "What brings you here?" She smiled, holding out the handkerchief. "I found something by the shop," she said. "A piece of metal near the door, and there's a scratch mark, like someone forced the lock. You might want to look." Reed's eyes widened as he took the sliver. "Forced entry. The inspector didn't mention anything like that. Where'd you find it?" "By the front door," she said, keeping her voice light. "I noticed it when I passed by. And there's another mark at the back. Could be important." Reed nodded, slipping the sliver into an envelope. "I'll show the inspector. If someone broke in, it changes things. Thank you, Miss Marple." She left, satisfied. The police would look closer now, but she wasn't done. She needed hard evidence, something to tie the suspects to the crimes. She thought about the shop's stock. If poisons were missing, the records would show it. Mr. Barnes would know, but he wasn't talking. She'd have to find another way. That afternoon, she visited the church again, hoping to catch the vicar. He kept records of village events, including the bazaar where Mr. Clement had seemed so cheerful. Maybe he'd noticed something. The church was empty, the air cool and still. She found the vicar in his office, sorting papers. "Miss Marple," he said, smiling. "A sad week, isn't it?" "Very sad," she agreed. "I was thinking about the bazaar. Mr. Clement was there, so happy. Did you see him with anyone unusual?" The vicar frowned, thinking. He was his usual self, chatting with everyone. "I did see him talking to Mr. Barnes, though. They stepped aside, looked serious. Couldn't hear what they said." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another hint of trouble between Mr. Clement and Barnes. "Thank you," she said. "It's good to remember him happy." She left the church, her mind racing. Barnes was at the centre of too many clues. Missing stock, arguments, nervous glances. But Harold's greed and Clara's grudge were just as strong. She needed to narrow it down, to find the link between the victims. As she walked home, she passed the river where Tommy had seen the stranger. The bridge was quiet, the water dark and slow. She paused, her eyes scanning the banks. Something glinted in the grass, a small bottle, half hidden. Her heart pounded as she knelt, careful not to touch it. It was like the ones in Mr. Clement's shop, clear glass with a cork stopper. Empty, but the label was gone, scratched off. She stood, her knees trembling. Cyanide? She couldn't be sure, but it was too close to Tommy's story to ignore. She marked the spot with a stick and hurried to the police station, telling Reed about the bottle. He promised to send someone to collect it, his face serious now. Miss Marple felt a surge of hope. If the bottle held traces of cyanide, it could point to the killer. Back home, she sat by the fire, her notebook open. She wrote, "Bottle by river, cyanide, Barnes, serious talk at bazaar, stranger, key or distraction?" She leaned back, her eyes half closed. The killer was clever, but they were slipping. The scratch marks, the sliver, the bottle, they were mistakes, small but real. The village clock struck 7, its chime echoing through the dusk. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly. She pictured the church, the shop, the river. The killer was part of St. Mary Mead, hiding behind a familiar face. Harold with his slick charm, Barnes with his guilty eyes, Clara with her buried pain, or the stranger, a shadow with a limp. She thought about a case years ago, a theft solved by a single footprint. The killer here was leaving footprints too, in the clues they couldn't hide. Miss Marple's needles moved faster, the shawl growing. She'd keep watching, listening, digging. The truth was close, and she wouldn't let it slip away. Outside, the wind howled, the village dark and quiet. St. Mary Mead was a place of secrets, but Miss Marple was its sharpest eye. The killer thought they were safe, but they didn't know her. She'd find them, step by step, until their mask fell. Chapter 6. The third victim Tuesday morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a pale, watery sun, but the village was far from bright. Fear had settled into its cobblestone streets, its neat cottages, its very air. 3 deaths in a week, Mr. Clement, Mrs. Gray, and now whispers of something new had turned the village into a place of locked doors and wary glances. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needle still, her pale blue shawl folded beside her. Her sharp eyes watched the street, but her mind was on the clues piling up, the cyanide in the brandy and lemonade, the scratch marks on the chemist's shop, the metal sliver, and the bottle by the river. A killer was stalking St. Mary Mead, and she was closer than ever to catching them. The village was a hive of worry. The police still called Mr. Clement's death a suicide, and Mrs. Gray's a heart attack, but no one believed it any more. Miss Marple's notebook was thick with notes. Harold Gray, greedy for his aunt's money. Mr. Barnes, the nervous assistant with access to poisons. Miss Clara, angry over her sister's death years ago, and the stranger with the limp, seen lurking with a bottle. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still blurry. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her heart heavy. She knew the killer was bold, striking in plain sight, but they were making mistakes, and she would find them. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion outside. She leaned closer to the window, her grey curls brushing the glass. Villagers were running toward the river, their voices sharp with panic. Miss Marple's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. She grabbed her coat and hat, her cane tapping as she hurried out. The air was cold, smelling of wet leaves and mud. She followed the crowd, her small frame moving faster than most would expect. At the riverbank, a small group stood frozen, staring at the ground. Miss Marple pushed through, her heart pounding. There, sprawled in the grass, was Tommy Pierce, the butcher's apprentice. His young face was pale, his eyes wide and lifeless. A small glass bottle lay clutched in his hand, its cork missing. The bitter almond smell of cyanide hung in the air, faint but unmistakable. Miss Marple's breath caught. Tommy? Dead? The boy who'd seen the stranger, who'd found the bottle by the river. Constable Reed was there, his face white as he knelt by the body. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice shaking. The crowd murmured, some crying, others whispering of a curse. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes sharp despite the horror. She saw the bottle, like the one she'd found yesterday, its label scratched off. Tommy's clothes were damp, as if he'd been by the river for hours. She looked at his face, his mouth twisted in pain. Cyanide again. The same killer. Dr. Haydock arrived, his bag in hand. He checked Tommy, his expression grim. "Poison," he said quietly. "Like the others. No mistake this time." The crowd gasped, fear rippling through them. 3 deaths, all poisoned. Miss Marple's mind raced. Tommy had seen something. Maybe the stranger, maybe more. The killer had silenced him, just as they'd silenced Mr. Clement and Mrs. Gray. She stepped back, letting Reed and the doctor work, but her eyes scanned the crowd. Harold Gray was there, his face pale, his hands in his pockets. Mr. Barnes stood at the edge, his eyes darting, his thin frame trembling. Miss Clara was absent, but that didn't mean much. Miss Marple filed their reactions away, each a clue in itself. She approached Reed, her voice soft but firm. "Constable, that bottle, did you check the one I found yesterday by the river?" Reed nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "We did. Traces of cyanide. The inspector's looking at it now. This one's the same, I'd bet." Miss Marple's heart sank, but she kept her face calm. "Tommy told me he saw the stranger again, with a bottle. He was scared. Whoever did this knew he'd seen something." Reed's eyes widened. "You think the killer got to him because of that?" "I'm sure of it," she said. "Be careful, Constable. This isn't over." She walked away, her cane steady despite the tremor in her hands. The village was in chaos, mothers pulling children inside, men talking of patrols. Miss Marple felt the weight of it all, but she pushed it aside. Grief wouldn't catch the killer. Focus would. She decided to visit Tommy's mother, Mrs. Pierce, to learn more. The boy's death was no accident, and his last days might hold the key. Mrs. Pierce lived in a small cottage near the butcher's shop, its windows dark with drawn curtains. Miss Marple knocked, her heart heavy. Mrs. Pierce opened the door, her face red from crying, her apron twisted in her hands. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice breaking, "my Tommy! He's gone!" Miss Marple stepped inside, her touch gentle as she guided Mrs. Pierce to a chair. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Tommy was a good boy. Can you tell me anything about the last few days?" Mrs. Pierce sobbed, but she nodded. "He was scared," she said, "ever since he saw that man by the shop, the one with the limp. He said the man saw him too, and gave him a look that chilled him. Last night he went to deliver meat by the river. Said he'd be quick. He never came home." Miss Marple's heart raced. The stranger again, and a threat. Did he say anything else? About the man or the shop? Mrs. Pierce wiped her eyes. "He said he saw the man drop something by the river. A bottle. Tommy thought it was odd, but he didn't touch it. He told me he was going to tell Constable Reed today. Oh, why didn't I stop him?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "You couldn't know. You've helped telling me this. We'll find who did this." She left the cottage, her mind spinning. Tommy had been a witness, maybe to the killer's actions. The stranger with the limp was no bystander. He was involved, dropping bottles, watching the shop. But was he Harold, Barnes, or someone else? She needed to check the shop again, to see if the police had found anything new. She walked to High Street. The village quiet now, its people hiding indoors. The chemist's shop was locked, but Constable Harris stood guard, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. "Bad day, isn't it?" "The worst," she agreed. "Have the police looked inside again? For missing stock, maybe?" Harris nodded. "The inspector's been through it, found some records off, bottles of cyanide not accounted for. They're questioning Mr. Barnes now." Miss Marple's heart skipped. Missing cyanide, just as she'd suspected. "Thank you, Constable," she said, and turned away, her mind racing. Barnes was in trouble, but that didn't clear Harold or Clara. She needed to see the shop's interior to look for clues the police missed. She waited until dusk, when Harris left for a break. The street was empty, the shop dark. She slipped into the alley, her cane silent. The back door's scratch. Mark was still there, a reminder of forced entry. She tried the door, expecting it locked, but it gave slightly, as if the lock was loose. Her breath caught. Had the killer returned? She pushed the door open, her heart pounding, and stepped inside. The shop was dim, smelling of chemicals and dust. Rows of bottles lined the shelves, their labels faint in the gloom. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. Near the counter, where Mr. Clement had died, she saw a small drawer, half open. She pulled it out, finding a ledger with messy handwriting. She squinted, reading by the light from a window. Entries for cyanide were crossed out, some marked sold, but with no buyer listed. Barnes's work, or the killer's? A noise, a creak, made her freeze. She slipped the ledger into her coat and hid behind a shelf, her heart racing. Footsteps, soft but real, came from the front. A shadow moved, then stopped. Miss Marple held her breath, her small frame pressed against the wall. The shadow passed, and the front door clicked shut. Whoever it was had left. She waited, then hurried out the back, her steps quick. The village was dark now, the air cold. She clutched the ledger, her mind buzzing. The missing cyanide, the loose door, the shadow. Someone was covering their tracks. But who? At home she locked her door and lit the fire, spreading the ledger on her table. The entries were sloppy, but clear. Cyanide had been taken bit by bit over weeks. No names, no proof, but it screamed guilt. Barnes had the keys, but Harold or Clara could have broken in. The stranger, too, fit the pattern. She took out her notebook and wrote, "Tommy, poisoned saw stranger. Cyanide missing, ledger, shadow in shop. Killer scared?" She paused, then added, 3 deaths, same poison, same hand. The pattern was undeniable now. The killer was tying up loose ends, and Tommy had been one. Miss Marple sat back, her eyes half closed. She pictured Tommy's face, so young, so scared. He died because he knew too much, just as Mrs. Gray had, just as Mr. Clement had. The killer was ruthless, but they were rattled. The ledger, the bottle, the scratch marks. They were slipping, leaving trails. She thought about her suspects. Harold, with his greedy eyes, could have poisoned his aunt for money. But why Mr. Clement or Tommy? Clara's pain over her sister was deep, but 3 murders seemed beyond her. Barnes, with his access and nerves, was the strongest link, but the stranger's limp didn't match him. The stranger, could he be a hired hand working for one of them? The village clock struck 9, its chime echoing through the night. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly. She needed a plan, something to draw the killer out. The ledger was proof, but not enough. She'd show it to Reed tomorrow, but first she'd watch her suspects closer. The village hall meeting was tomorrow night, a chance to see them all together. She remembered a case years ago, a murderer caught by a single lie. This killer was lying too, hiding behind smiles and alibis. But Miss Marple was watching her, mind sharp as a needle. She'd find the truth, stitch by stitch, until the killer had nowhere to hide. Outside the wind moaned, the village dark and silent. St. Mary Mead was a place of fear now, its secrets deadly. But Miss Marple was its quiet guardian, and she wouldn't rest until the killer was caught. Chapter 7. The trap is set. Wednesday morning in St. Mary Mead was cold and bleak. the sky a dull grey that matched the village's mood. Fear had taken root, its tendrils curling around every cottage and cobblestone path. 3 deaths, Mr. Clement, Mrs. Gray, and young Tommy Pierce, had left the village shaken, its people locking doors and whispering of a killer in their midst. Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles still, her pale blue shawl folded neatly. Her sharp eyes were calm, but her mind was a whirlwind, piecing together clues, the cyanide in the brandy, lemonade, and Tommy's bottle, the scratch marks on the chemist's shop, the metal sliver, the ledger of missing poisons, and the stranger with the limp. The killer was close, and she was ready to catch them. The village was alive with panic. The police had finally admitted Mr. Clement's death was murder, and Tommy's poisoning left no doubt. Mrs. Gray's heart attack was under scrutiny too, thanks to Miss Marple's nudge about the cyanide smell. Her notebook was thick with suspects. Harold Gray, greedy for his aunt's fortune. Mr. Barnes, the nervous assistant with access to poisons. Miss Clara, fueled by an old grudge. And the mysterious stranger, seen lurking with a bottle. Each fit the puzzle, but only one was the killer. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her heart steady. She needed a spark to flush them out, and she had a plan. The village hall meeting was set for that evening, a gathering to discuss the deaths and calm fears. Miss Marple saw it as her chance. The killer was rattled. Tommy's death proved it. They were tying up loose ends, but they were sloppy, leaving bottles and ledger entries behind. She decided to set a trap, to spread a rumour that would make the killer act. She'd whisper that she'd found a witness, someone who saw the murderer at the shop. If the killer took the bait, they'd reveal themselves, even if just by a nervous glance. She started at the post office, where Mrs. Price was sorting mail, her face pale. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "Folks are scared to step outside. 3 murders. It's unthinkable." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle. "It's awful," she said, "but I heard something curious. A witness, someone who saw the killer near the shop the night Mr. Clement died. They're talking to the police soon." Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "A witness? Who?" Miss Marple smiled, vague. "I shouldn't say, but it's promising. The truth's coming out." She left, knowing Mrs. Price would spread the word faster than a fire through dry grass. She stopped by the bakery next, repeating the story to the grocer's wife, who gasped and promised to tell others. By noon, the village was buzzing with the rumour of a witness, and Miss Marple was sure the killer had heard. She felt a prickle of excitement, like a stitch falling into place. She spent the afternoon preparing. She took the ledger from the shop, the metal sliver, and her notebook, tucking them into a locked drawer. The ledger showed missing cyanide, enough to kill 3 times over. The sliver proved forced entry. If the killer came for her, they'd find nothing. She dressed for the meeting, choosing her grey dress and straw hat, her cane polished and ready. The village hall was a short walk, but she left early, wanting to watch people arrive. The hall was a plain building with wooden beams and long tables lit by flickering lamps. Villagers filled the chairs, their faces tense, their voices a low hum. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her eyes scanning the crowd. Harold Gray was there, his slick hair gleaming, his smile too tight. Mr. Barnes sat in a corner, his hands twisting, his eyes darting to the door. Miss Clara was near the front, her shawl tight, her lips thin. The stranger with the limp was nowhere, but Miss Marple hadn't expected him. He was a shadow, not a face in the crowd. Constable Reed stood at the front, his young face serious. "Thank you for coming," he said. "We know you're scared. The police are working hard. We've found evidence, missing poisons, signs of a break-in. We're close to answers." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shaking their heads. Miss Marple watched her suspects. Harold's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming on his knee. Mr. Barnes sank lower in his chair, his face pale. Clara's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, then away. They'd heard the rumour, she was sure. Her heart beat faster, but her face stayed, calm like a pond with no ripples. The vicar spoke next, urging calm and prayer. Miss Marple barely listened, her eyes moving from Harold to Barnes to Clara. She noticed Harold whispering to a man beside him, his gestures quick. Barnes kept glancing at the window, as if expecting someone. Clara clutched her handbag, her knuckles white. The trap was working. The killer was nervous. As the meeting ended, villagers stood, their voices rising. Miss Marple lingered, pretending to drop her knitting. She bent to pick it up, her eyes sharp. She saw Mr. Barnes slip out the side door, his steps quick and quiet. Her heart raced. Was he running or planning something? She stood, her cane steady, and moved toward the door, keeping to the shadows. Outside, the night was cold, the stars hidden by clouds. Miss Marple followed Barnes at a distance, her small frame blending into the dark. He was heading toward her cottage, his head down, his hands in his pockets. Her breath caught. The trap had worked too well. He was coming for her, or for the evidence she'd hinted at. She quickened her pace, her mind racing. She needed help. But the village was quiet, the streets empty. She reached the churchyard, a shortcut to her cottage, and saw Constable Reed near the gate, checking his notebook. "Constable!" she called, her voice low but urgent. "Mr. Barnes is my cottage. I think he's after something. Hurry!" Reed's eyes widened, but he nodded, grabbing his whistle. They moved together, Reed's long strides matching her determined steps. At her cottage, they saw a shadow by the garden gate. Mr. Barnes holding a small bottle, his hands shaking. Reed shouted, "Barnes, stop!" Barnes froze, the bottle slipping from his fingers. It hit the ground, unbroken, but the smell of cyanide wafted up. Miss Marple's heart pounded, but she stayed calm. "Careful, Constable," she said. "That's poison." Reed grabbed Barnes, pinning his arms. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Barnes stammered, his face white. I wasn't going to hurt anyone. I needed to check something." Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes piercing. "Check what, Mr. Barnes? The ledger? The sliver? Or were you planting that bottle to make me look guilty?" Untraceable shook his head, his voice breaking. "No, I swear, Reed cut him off, cuffing his hands. "You're coming with me. We'll sort this at the station." Miss Marple watched as Reed led Barnes away, the bottle left for evidence. She felt a surge of triumph, but it was tempered by doubt. Barnes was caught. But was he the killer? His fear seemed real, his actions clumsy. The killer was clever, striking without a trace. She needed to be sure. Back inside, she locked her door and lit the fire, her hands steady despite the night's drama. She took out her notebook and wrote, "Barnes, caught with cyanide at cottage. Trap worked. Killer or pawn?" She paused, then added, "Harold, Clara, still suspects. Stranger, where?" She sat back, her mind replaying the meeting. Harold's tight jaw, Clara's white knuckles. They'd been nervous too. Barnes was the obvious choice, with his access to poisons and the ledger's proof. But something felt off. The stranger with the limp was still a mystery, and Clara's grudge was deep. Harold's greed could have driven him to kill all three, if he thought they knew something. She thought about the ledger, its sloppy entries hiding theft. Barnes had the keys, but anyone could have forced the door, as the scratch marks showed. The cyanide was taken over weeks, planned carefully. Tommy's death was rushed, though, a sign the killer was scared. Miss Marple's trap had pushed them to act, but had she caught the right person? She stood and paced, her small frame moving with purpose. The village hall had been her stage, and Barnes had played his part, but the play wasn't over. She needed to talk to Reed to see what Barnes said. She also needed to watch Harold and Clara closer. The killer was still out there, or they were in cuffs, trembling with guilt. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls. Miss Marple pictured the shop, the river, the garden party. 3 deaths, all cyanide, all planned. Mr. Clement knew something, maybe about the missing stock. Mrs. Gray asked questions, threatening the killer's secret. Tommy saw too much, his sharp eyes his undoing. The killer was tying up loose ends, but Miss Marple was the loosest end of all. She remembered a case years ago, a thief caught by a trap like hers. He'd panicked, just as Barnes had. But the real culprit was quieter, watching from the sidelines. Was Barnes a pawn, set up to take the fall? She needed to know. The village clock struck 10, its chime echoing through the night. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly. She'd go to the police station tomorrow, hear Barnes's story, check the bottle for prints. The trap had worked, but the truth was still a stitch away. She'd keep pulling, watching, waiting. Outside the wind howled, the village dark and silent. St. Mary Mead was a place of secrets, but Miss Marple was its sharpest eye. The killer thought they were safe, but they didn't know her. She'd find them, step by step, until their lies unraveled. Chapter 8. The Killer Unmasked. Thursday morning in St. Mary Mead was quiet, the village holding its breath after a week of terror. 3 murders, Mr. Clement, Mrs. Gray, and young Tommy Pierce, had left scars on the cobblestone streets and cosy cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving slowly, her pale blue shawl nearly finished. Her sharp eyes were calm, but her mind was sharp, piecing together the final clues. The cyanide in the brandy, lemonade, and Tommy's bottle. The scratch marks on the chemist's shop. The metal sliver, the ledger of missing poisons, and Mr. Barnes's capture last night with a bottle of poison. The trap she'd set at the village hall had worked, but was Barnes the killer, or just a frightened pawn? She was about to find out. The village was still reeling. The police had Mr. Barnes in custody, and whispers of his guilt spread like smoke. Miss Marple's notebook was open, her neat handwriting listing the suspects. Harold Gray, greedy for his aunt's money, Mr. Barnes, the nervous assistant with access to poisons, Miss Clara, driven by an old grudge, and the stranger with the limp, a shadow in Tommy's stories. Her trap had flushed out Barnes, but doubts lingered. The killer was clever, striking without a trace, while Barnes had panicked, dropping the bottle in her garden. She needed his confession to be sure. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her heart steady. She'd visit the police station today, hear what Barnes had said, and check the evidence, the bottle, the ledger, the sliver. The killer's motive tied the deaths together, and she was close to seeing it. Mr. Clement knew something dangerous. Mrs. Gray asked too many questions. And Tommy saw too much. The killer was silencing threats. But Miss Marple was the biggest threat of all, and she wasn't afraid. She put on her coat and straw hat, her cane tapping as she stepped outside. The air was cold, the sky a pale grey. Villagers moved quietly, their faces tired but hopeful. The news of Barnes's arrest had eased some fears, but Miss Marple knew the truth wasn't settled yet. She walked to the police station, a small building near the village square. Constable Reed was at the desk, his young face worn from long nights. "Miss Marple," he said, standing, "you've got a knack for this. That trap of yours caught Barnes red-handed." She smiled, her eyes gentle but piercing. "I hope so. Constable, has he said anything?" Reed nodded, leading her to a small room. "He's talking, but it's a mess. Says he's innocent, but the bottle had cyanide, same as the murders. The inspector's with him now. Want to listen?" Miss Marple agreed, sitting in a chair by the door. Through a small window, she saw Mr. Barnes, his thin frame hunched, his hands cuffed. The inspector, a stern man named Carter, was questioning him, his voice sharp. "Barnes, we've got you with the bottle, caught at Miss Marple's cottage," Carter said. "Cyanide, just like the murders. Start talking, or it's the gallows." Barnes' voice trembled, his eyes darting. "I didn't kill anyone, I swear. I was scared. Someone told me to hide the bottle, to make it look like Miss Marple did it." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she stayed still, listening. Carter leaned closer. "Who told you? Stop lying, Barnes." Barnes shook his head, tears streaming. "I can't say. They'll kill me too. I took the cyanide, yes, but not to kill. I sold it on the side to make money. Mr. Clement found out, said he'd turn me in. I panicked." Miss Marple's breath caught. Sold cyanide? That was the motive, the thread tying it all together. She leaned closer, her ears sharp as Carter pressed on. "Panicked how?" Carter demanded. "You poisoned him, didn't you? And Mrs. Gray, and the boy." Barnes sobbed, his voice breaking. "I had to. Clement was going to ruin me. He knew I was selling poisons, cyanide, arsenic, to people outside the village. Black market, you know. He threatened to tell the police. I slipped cyanide in his brandy, just a bit, when he wasn't looking. He drank it that night." Miss Marple's heart sank, but she kept listening. Barnes was confessing, and the truth was spilling out like water from a cracked jug. "And Mrs. Gray?" Carter asked. "Why her?" Barnes wiped his eyes. She was part of the shop, a silent partner. She noticed the stock was off, started asking questions. She came to the shop that night, arguing with Clement about it. I heard them. Clara was right about the woman's voice. Mrs. Gray said she'd check the books herself. I couldn't let her. At her garden party, I put cyanide in her lemonade. It was easy. She always had a glass." Miss Marple nodded to herself. The angry woman's voice wasn't Clara or a stranger. It was Mrs. Gray, digging too deep. But Tommy's death was still a piece missing. "And the boy? Tommy Pierce?" Carter pressed, his voice hard. "What did he do to you?" Barnes's voice dropped, barely a whisper. "He saw me by the river, hiding a bottle I'd used. I dropped it and he was there watching. He ran off, but I knew he'd talk. I followed him the next night, gave him a bottle laced with cyanide, said it was soda. He drank it and he was gone." Miss Marple's heart ached for Tommy. So young, so trusting. But her mind was clear now. Barnes was the killer, his greed and fear driving him to murder. The stranger with the limp, though, where did he fit? Carter leaned back, his face grim. And this stranger everyone's talking about, the one with the limp? Barnes shook his head. "I don't know. I never saw him. Maybe Tommy made him up, or maybe he was just a traveller. I swear it was just me." Miss Marple frowned, her mind turning. The stranger was a loose end, but Barnes's confession was solid, backed by the ledger, the bottle, and the cyanide. She stood, signalling to Reed. "Thank you, Constable," she said. "I think we have our answer." She left the station, her steps slow but steady. The village was waking up, the air less heavy now that the killer was caught. She walked home, her cane tapping, her mind sorting the final pieces. Barnes had motive, protecting his black market scheme. He had means, the shop's cyanide, stolen over weeks, as the ledger showed. He had opportunity, slipping poison into brandy, lemonade, and Tommy's bottle. The scratch marks and metal sliver proved he'd broken in to cover his tracks, maybe to plant evidence or steal more poison. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and sat with her knitting. The needles clicked, the shawl growing, its stitches neat and sure. She took out her notebook and wrote, "Barnes confessed, sold cyanide, killed to hide it. Clement knew too much. Gray asked questions. Tommy saw bottle, stranger, nothing." She paused, then added, "Case closed." She leaned back, her eyes half closed. The stranger with the limp was the only shadow left, but Tommy's fear had been real. Maybe he'd seen Barnes, not a stranger, and his young mind mixed up the details. Or maybe the stranger was a red herring, a ghost born of village gossip. Either way, Barnes's confession fit the clues, and the murders stopped with him. She thought about Harold Gray. His greed had made him a suspect, but he was innocent, just a man chasing money he'd never get. Miss Clara's grudge was real, but her anger hadn't turned to murder. The woman's voice she'd heard was Mrs. Gray's, arguing with Mr. Clement. The ledger, the bottles, the scratch marks, all pointed to Barnes. A man undone by his own fear. Miss Marple stood and walked to her window, looking out at the village. The cottages glowed with lamplight, the streets quiet again. St. Mary Mead was healing, its fear fading like mist in the sun. She'd done her part, pulling the truth from the shadows, stitch by stitch. The killer was caught, the village safe. She remembered a case years ago, a liar caught by a single slip. Barnes had slipped too, caught by her trap. his panic betraying him. She'd known evil hid in plain sight, wearing a nervous smile, counting pills in a shop, but it couldn't hide from her. The village clock struck noon, its chime soft and clear. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking faster now. The shawl was nearly done, its edges smooth, its pattern complete. She smiled, a quiet satisfaction in her heart. Justice was done, and St. Mary Mead could sleep soundly again. She thought about Tommy, so brave, and Mrs. Gray, so curious, and Mr. Clement, so kind. They were gone, but not forgotten. Their deaths had led her to the truth, and she honoured them by finding it. The killer thought they were clever, but they didn't know Miss Marple, her sharp eyes, her patient mind. Outside, a soft rain began, pattering on the windows. The village was at peace, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting in her lap, her heart light. Evil had come to St. Mary Mead, but it hadn't won. She'd seen to that, and she always would.